This is the fourth video dealing with demography, and again what I would like all of you to be reading is chapter 2 in the textbook. Let's move on to our learning objectives. There are three. First, we're going to get into a little bit more detail now with the demographic transition model, and I would like everyone to understand some of the details that we cover. The second is I would like all of you to understand, once we get through the demographic transition model, what countries in the world are currently in stage 3 in contrast to what countries in the world are currently in stage 4 of the demographic transition. And then finally, our third learning objective is we're going to take a close look at a tool that demographers use. They are population pyramids. So let's return to our discussion of the demographic transition model and look at some of the details. What I would like to do is I would like all of you to understand what is happening in each one of the 4 stages with regard to 3 of our 4 demographic markers. On the graph that we have right here, we can see what's happening with regard to the birth rate. We can also see what's happening with the death rate. This is the crude birth rate and the crude death rate, or the CBR and the CDR. From these two, we could also say something about the RNI. So let's begin. Stage 1 of the demographic transition. If you look carefully here, both the crude birth rate and the crude death rate are high. What this probably means is that stage 1 of the demographic transition is associated with agricultural societies. Not very urban, but the overwhelming majority of people are involved in agriculture. In other words, societies before the Industrial Revolution. Not modern societies like the United States today or Japan today, but maybe the United States and Japan way back in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Now imagine what that means. The crude birth rate was probably high in stage 1 of the demographic transition because agricultural families need to have a lot of kids. There's a great demand for labor power, lots of chores. The death rate would also be high because in that earlier stage of development we didn't have much in the way of medical technology. No penicillin to treat infections, and our understanding of disease and what causes disease would have been rudimentary at best. Stage 2 of the demographic transition, notice what happens. It's quite remarkable. The crude birth rate is still very, very high, but the crude death rate plummets. It drops really, really quickly. And so there suddenly is a big distance between the crude death rate and the crude birth rate. And you know what that means? It means the RNI is going to skyrocket. It's going to go from basically 0, because the crude death rate and crude birth rate are basically going to cancel each other out here in stage 1. Suddenly the RNI is going to jump to 3, 4, even 5% per year. And so in stage 2 of the demographic transition, what makes it distinct from stage 1 is that the population begins to grow, and grow really dramatically. So much so that there's basically a population explosion. Stage 3 of the demographic transition looks very similar. The crude death rate is very low now. The crude birth rate is still quite high, but also notice that in the second half of stage 3, all of a sudden the crude birth rate begins to drop quite dramatically. So that by the time you get to stage 4 of the demographic transition, you have both a low crude death rate and a low crude birth rate. Kind of like the mirror image of stage 1, but what this means is that population explosion associated with stage 2 and stage 3 has now come to a dramatic close. Because when the crude birth rate and the crude death rate are close to one another, your RNI is going to be close to 0. They're basically canceling one another out. So, to summarize, stage 1 of the demographic transition, you don't have a lot of population growth. You still have a high crude birth rate, but you also have a high crude death rate. Stage 4 of the demographic transition, you don't have a lot of population growth. The reason is that you have both a low crude death rate and also a low crude birth rate, canceling each other out. Thus the RNI is close to 0. In both stage 3 and stage 2 of the demographic transition, in contrast, there's a big distance between the crude birth rate and the crude death rate. That means that your rate of natural increase is incredibly high. It also means then that the population is quite literally growing and growing very, very quickly. The way they put it here is a population explosion. Now, let's talk just a little bit about what stage 4 of the demographic transition means. Typically, stage 4 is found in those countries that have gone through the Industrial Revolution. They've become highly urbanized societies that typically are characterized by smaller family size. They have higher levels of education, and the result is that people change their fertility in response to this new way of life. In city life, it no longer makes sense to have such large families. In fact, having too many children could be understood as a burden. They all want to go to college. They're all going to require tuition. And the result then is that people begin to adapt to this new reality, and the result is that the birth rate goes down. Now, there's just one more thing that I want to talk about before we go on to the next slide, and that is this. I want to explain why the death rate drops really dramatically in stage 2, and then correspondingly, I want to explain why the birth rate eventually drops in the second half of stage 3. Let's start out with the death rate. The reason the death rate drops dramatically in stage 2 of the demographic transition is basically because of technological advance. In the case of the United States, we entered stage 2 of the demographic transition right around 1850. And right around that time, if you look at the data, the death rate in the United States begins to go down. Here's why. After 1850, we start having much more advanced medical technology. We have the beginnings of the modern medical age with penicillin, and our understanding of disease transmission becomes much more full than it would have been previously. We also become a more urbanized society where people tend to live in big cities, and we start building infrastructure associated with, for example, water treatment facilities. We have sewage systems, all of which lower the death rate as well. And to add one more technological advance that is responsible for pushing down the death rate in American history, we might even add the railroad. Because what the railroad does is allow certain parts of the country to connect with other parts of the country, and thus food can travel along those routes, making it less likely that one part of the country would have an episode of starvation. So it's primarily then technology that drops the death rate in stage 2. The other question, why does the birth rate drop? It has to do primarily with culture. Eventually the culture and the cultural values sort of catch up with, if you will, the new reality of living in cities in an industrial economy. People begin to change their fertility habits in response to where they're living. The values change in really peculiar and interesting ways as well. We become more individualistic in a modern industrial society. It's less about the family and the community and more about our own individual ambitions. And the result is that our values begin to have an effect on the rate of fertility, or the crude birth rate. So, to summarize them, the aspects of the demographic transition that are really important for us to understand are right through here. Number 1, stages 2 and 3 of the demographic transition are characterized by a population explosion because the crude birth rate is so much higher than the crude death rate. The reason that the crude birth rate, the crude death rate drops so dramatically in stage 2 is primarily because of advances in technology. Correspondingly, the crude birth rate drops eventually in the late stage of stage 3 because of changes in culture and cultural values. In particular, the values that we might point to are found right here. More people in stage 4 and late stage 3 of the demographic transition live in big cities. Fewer are involved in agriculture. That changes our views on fertility and family size. We also become a much more individualistic society, characterized by higher levels of materialism. We want careerism, so we can afford some of the material goods that we would like. And so we end up basically delaying family formation and spending more time in school. In addition, there's also greater equality between the genders and the sexes associated with stage 4 and late stage 3 of the demographic transition. And when men and women are basically equal with regard to political and economic power, family size tends to go down, and our ideals about fertility tend to change as a result. Now, what I want to do is I want to connect the demographic transition back to this map we looked at in a previous video. And it's, of course, the crude birth rate. We've seen this already. Remember that global north, by and large, a low crude birth rate. Global south, generally speaking, much higher crude birth rates. You can actually connect this to stage of the demographic transition. The United States and Canada, both clearly in stage 4 of the demographic transition. Other states in the Americas that are likely in stage 4 would include Argentina and Chile, because they both have a very low crude birth rate. Mexico, on the other hand, with a moderate crude birth rate, is likely in the latest part of stage 3, but it's soon to progress to stage 4 of the demographic transition. And some parts of sub-Saharan Africa that are more agricultural and less urban as of the early 21st century are probably in the middle part of stage 3 of the demographic transition, where they still have an exceptionally high crude birth rate. Now, there is one other set of ideas that I want to talk about before we close this particular video lecture. We can also look at what are called population pyramids. They're sometimes called age-sex pyramids, and what they are is a graphical representation of the demographic structure of a society. Notice over here on the left side of the slide we have West Africa. So this could be any West African country. Niger, Nigeria, Togo, Benin, what have you. Over here we have Western Europe. It could be Great Britain, France, Germany, again, what have you. And each one of these population pyramids is a representative population pyramid for that particular world region. Notice in West Africa, you have basically a triangular shaped population pyramid that's very bottom heavy. What this means is you probably have a relatively high crude birth rate. Notice there's a lot of young people, and there's not a whole lot of older people. And what that probably means is that the median age in West African societies is relatively low, perhaps about 18 or maybe possibly 25. In Western Europe, in contrast, you have a population pyramid that's somewhat more rectangular in its shape, less triangular, and there's also kind of a bulge of people in the middle age. And what that means is the crude birth rate has been low for quite some time. It also means that the median age here is likely quite high. What this then means is we can connect this to stage of the demographic transition. West Africa clearly in stage 3 of the demographic transition, and it has a unique population pyramid as a result. Western Europe, on the other hand, in stage 4 of the demographic transition, and again, it has a unique population pyramid as a result. When we get to the next slide, which will be the final slide, we're going to try to link this to our final topic, which is a discussion of the dependency ratio.